Good day. As usual, Dawie has a good turnout. I see some new and some familiar faces. Also, as usual with Dawie, I have the pleasure of introducing him. And also, as usual, I'll give you a short CV and tell you that it really doesn't capture who Dawie is. A very strange character with very strange values and beliefs and behaviors. One eminently is going to be running the New York Marathon next week. So he's a super fit guy. He cycles hundreds of K, and he loves animals, and he has some very strange views on almost everything. So he's the kind of mind I particularly like. I just like the lateral thinking. I like the radical thinking, the creative thinking, and Dawie certainly is an exemplar of those views. Dawie was one of the founders, he's a director and he's chief economist of the Efficient Group. And the Efficient Group has appointed Julius Malema and Ace Magashula to do their promotion for them. Every time they speak, people visit the Efficient Group and say, please get my money out. So they've got the best PR agency you could ask for. And he's a leading South African economist, very much in demand, as we know, on local media. He has controversial views, but his views are always well defended and argued. And he's entertaining, energetic, South Africa's most referenced economist, and in 2018 won the prestigious Economist of the Year award from SACA 24. He's anchored, and the Royneks here wouldn't know this, a television program on Bait Saka for 13 years, a very popular morning television program. But he's even had me as a guest there. The ratings fell precipitously after that, so I've never been invited back again. He's done that for 13 years. He's a frequent guest on news and current affairs programs and a frequent guest here at the Free Market Foundation. He's written extensively for radio and media. He authored Tax, Lies and Red Tape. Now, in case you wondered what his values and beliefs are, if that title doesn't help you, then you can't be helped. Mm-hmm. Over the last 30 years of experience, Dawie has specialized in monetary and fiscal policy and is currently undertaking extensive research on the possible impact of cryptocurrencies on monetary policy. So he's done a lot of work and thought about the whole idea of cryptocurrencies, and anyone who can collar him afterwards could get his wit and wisdom on it. In recent years, his interest and knowledge on international and local politics has been expanded, and his academic achievements include master's degree cum laude in economics, and he's served as an economist at the South African Reserve Bank. He's been a regular and popular speaker here, and what he seems to achieve, which is quite an accomplishment, is that everyone who's heard him at each of those talks is surprised to find he's got another talk, and it's not just the same Dawie saying the same things. And I think this one might be particularly interesting because he's delving into some of his areas of interest which are not publicly known. So with that, Dawie, please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leon. I understand the matric started writing exams today, so I feel more or less the same as they felt this morning, I'm sure. So the first couple of minutes is always difficult for me to get going. So I've got a presentation there where the snacks are. I brought a couple of skulls, replicas of skulls. There's actually one actual one of some Australopithecines, Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba, and also one Homo-Naledi, and a copy of Homo-Naledi's one hand and a foot of hers, of him. I'm not sure what it is. And that is one of my interests, and that is about where we come from. My daughter is a geneticist, and she convinced me to do my genetic test, and I will share that with you, where I come from. This is my ancestry. I had my genomes analyzed, and I am 95%, 95.8% European, and that's where I come from, all those places. Where's he lucky? I think it's that. Well, this is where I come from, Northern Europe, and some French stuff, and so on and so on and so on. Interesting stuff. If you go down, that is 95% of what I am. Then Western Asia, North America, I come from there as well. And Central and South Asia, I even come from there as well. So that's my genetic composition. There's some other interesting stuff about me, like for instance, I can smell in your urine whether you've eaten asparagus or not. And really I can do that. I'm still trying to figure out how I can use this special talent. Okay, but the really interesting part is that I have 285 Neanderthal variants in me, and I'm roughly about 4% Neanderthal. So if I have to fill in my racial stuff that you have to complete if you're in South Africa, you also have to fill in some racial issues somewhere, then I tell them that I am not black or white, or I'm not even other. I've got my own category, and I call myself a hybrid because I am. I'm from different species. Okay, so that's a bit of and something that really interests me. And my presentation, or the question I've been asking is that if you go back 100,000 years, for example, there were at least 4 species of human, or homos, on this planet. And here they are. This is about 100,000 years ago. The first one, of course, the one that survived, the only one that survived is Homo sapiens, and we're all Homo sapiens. A couple of other ones, Homo neanderthalensis, and that's one of my forefathers, 4% at least. Homo neanderthalensis, the last one, probably died out about 15,000 years or so ago. There must have been a lot of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. Homo-Naledi, I've got a copy of Homo-Naledi's skull out there, was discovered recently at Sterkfontein, yeah? And then one that we don't know that much about, that is mostly from Asia, and that's Homo denisovan's. So those are the 4 Homo species, and they existed about 100,000 years ago, all of them. In fact, there was an overlap between Homo sapiens and Homo-Naledi of at least 100,000 years in the same area in southern Africa. And I've got a suspicion, if we can somehow get DNA for Homo-Naledi, we will probably find that in modern humans as well. So they're exactly the same as the overlap between Europeans and Neanderthalensis. I'm pretty sure we must have been some interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Naledi as well. We do not have Naledi genetic material yet. But the question the question I want to ask is, why is that these 4 Homo species existed? Maybe there were more, but why is it that the 4 of them existed, but only one survived? Why is that so? Now, there could be a number of reasons why that could be so. Now, let me just show you a couple of pictures, a couple of interesting pictures. This is not Homo-Naledi. This is actually the Taung child. And the discovery of the Taung child close to Taung in southern Africa, that actually changed paleoanthropology. Before that, the Europeans thought that people evolved in Europe, and that proved that people actually evolved in Africa mostly. But here a couple of Homo-Naledis. This is the Homo-Naledi's pictures that I took at Wits. Quite interesting stuff. I've got a copy of a skull outside there of Homo-Naledi. That's okay. So why did we win the fight? Why is it that we survived and the other Homo species all died out? Now here a couple of, and I really don't know, so I'm playing around with a couple of things. And if we can find out what the reason is why certain species survived and the others not, then maybe we can sort of figure out why we were successful and see how successful we were, and maybe we can use this information. Now, could it be because of the physique, because we were better? I'm not so sure. Some of the Homo species, like for example Homo floresiensis, was a tiny guy like this. They call it a hobbit. So they were really small. It was very small cranium. They obviously were not as bright as us. Some other guys, like for example Homo neanderthalensis, they were really big, and the cranium was even bigger than that of on average Homo sapiens. So I'm not so sure it was really about physique. It must have been something else. Could it have been about brains? Yes, I'm sure brains played a role, but there are without a doubt that Homo neanderthalensis, for example, also were quite clever. So maybe it played a role, I don't know. I think culture was quite interesting. And the interesting thing about culture, we all have some sort of culture, and culture of course, you have to define that. But culture, I think, is also a result of something else. It's just an interesting point. Homo-Naledi that they discovered here, not too far from here, there are signs that they had some kind of culture, because it looks as if they intentionally buried their dead people. So they were put together at a certain spot. That couldn't have happened naturally. So you can ask the question, did they believe in some sort of afterlife maybe? I'm not sure. I don't know. So, but there are signs. Somebody even made the comment that maybe there could have been a mass murderer that killed a lot of Naledis and put all the bodies there, because they're all put together at one specific spot. Technology, without a doubt, also played a very important role. But I think the real difference between us and the other guys that died out has to do with values. We started this whole thing. We became successful because of values, because we were on the brink of becoming extinct, human sapiens as well. But somehow we made it to survive, and I think I may have some of the answers for that. And I think the answer to that has to do, and it must have to do, with private property rights. Because as far as I am aware, it is only private, and I mean that, it's only Homo sapiens that had private property rights, or understand the importance of real private property rights, and that's how we became wealthy. Because the only way that you can become wealthy is through a free lunch. And there's only one free lunch. There is only one free lunch, and that free lunch is called trade. Now think about that. You cannot trade with another person. Initially, we survived. We were hunter-gatherers. You kill something and you eat it. But once we became property owners, we realized that there are instances when my property is less valuable to me than to somebody else, and somebody else is prepared to give me something in return for my property that I consider of higher or more value. And when we do an exchange of these two properties, I will gain and the other person will gain as well. And that is the only real free lunch, and that is trade. But you cannot trade if you do not own something. And I think that's the key. That is why we were successful, and I'm going to show you how successful we were, but that is the key to why we survived and the other guys did not make it. Okay, and of course that led to all sort of social structures, which is important to support this whole process of the unlocking all these free lunches that are created through trade. Now, how did the whole thing started? Just going back a little bit in history. The first time that this concept of private property rights was established happened probably around about 15,000 years ago, or a little bit longer. Keep in mind that the last Neanderthal died out probably around about 15,000 years ago. There are signs that some of them survived in southern Europe. So they died out around about 15,000 years ago. There were relatively few Homo sapiens at that stage on this planet. It was very tough to survive before that, because we were hunter-gatherers, and the life expectancy before, around about 20,000 years ago and longer back, 20,000 years ago, life expectancy for hunter-gatherers was around about 25 years. That's how long you could expect to live on average. Then we started domesticating animals for the first time, and if you domesticate animals for the first time, something that happens is, for the first time, something belonged to somebody. And the moment it belongs to you, you can use this ownership, the right to something, to exchange for something else. And that happened 15,000 years ago. And suddenly, that resulted in this huge production, this surplus production. We could support bigger groups. Our diets changed, life expectancy increased and all that. And that also created an opportunity to support bigger people, and that created the opportunity to start what we call civilizations today. Different social classes, different cultures and the like. The second major breakthrough, and that has to do with private property rights as well, was when we first domesticated plants, especially grains, and that happened approximately 8,000 years ago, allowing us to produce an even bigger surplus, allowing us to support even bigger groups. And of course, allowing us to trade more with one another. If you produce this huge surplus, you can exchange your huge surplus, and you can exchange it for something else that you do not produce, allowing us to start specializing as well. And by the way, the difference between plants and animals is that plants do not move around like animals. And while we're sitting around planting something on a piece of land, then the concept of ownership over a piece of land also became important. And we started putting rules in place to protect private property as well, fixed property as well. And where we are today, we also protect even stuff that we cannot touch, things that we quite often cannot even see, and that's intellectual property. That is part of the modern economy. Today, we also expand this thing that we call private property rights to even include things that we even cannot touch and things that we even can't see. Okay, so that I believe was the first step. So we started to trade with one another, and the moment you start trading with one another, that led to all sort of other things. And one of the first things, of course, what happens is that the moment that you start creating a civilization, all sort of different social groups emerge, and a very important social group, well, a very unimportant social group that also emerges, and that's the kings and the queens and the politicians, all right? And of course, when you have these ineptocrats, when you have these parasites, they want to take money out of your pockets, and that's taxes, and that was probably the beginning of record keeping, of writing. Politicians knew that they wanted to exert or take so much out of whatever you produce. They wanted to keep record of that, and that was and taxes, in a way, was led to a very important breakthrough, and that is record keeping, which probably led to something that we call writing today. Many other things will be also discovered over time. Many other economic breakthroughs were very important, but one of the other greatest economic breakthrough that is worth mentioning, apart from alcohol, of course, and that is that was the discovery or the invention of money. Now, money is of the utmost importance because, and I said that the only free lunch is for two individuals to trade goods between one another. And remember, there's a cost involved in trading, but the moment you introduce money, that trading becomes much easier, and the more we trade, the more free lunches we create. And the more free lunches we create, the wealthier we become. So the invention of money was one of those things that actually contributed to this whole process of wealth creation. Okay, so I've been putting a little bit of emphasis on this thing called the free lunch. So let's see if we can understand that a little bit better. This is a normal supply and demand curve. We all understand the supply and demand curve. We've gone through university, and I know many economists will disagree with me, and I know there are different various ways that you can look in supply and demand, and I know there are comments about that we will never reach an equilibrium. I understand that, but I just want to use this for simplicity's sake. Remember, there's a buyer and a seller that do a transaction. But the buyer, for example, is not only paying a price for a bread. The buyer also gets into his car, drives to the cafe, do not go to the liquor stop, but go to the cafe. So there are many costs involved, and eventually he walks into the cafe and he pays his 20 rand for his loaf of bread. So it's not only the price of the bread that matters, but it's a whole process to get where you are prepared to pay 20 rand for a loaf of bread. The guy that produces the bread, or the guy that sells the bread, he also has a lot of costs involved. He's got to keep his shop open. There are many other things. You have to get a guard if necessary. He has to produce the bread itself. He has to go and buy the bread. So it's not only the price of bread, but it's all the other costs involved that is important as well. So people, quite often, economists make the mistake in saying that the equilibrium is for the price of bread to be 20 rand as an example. That is only part of the whole story, because the bigger story is the price of bread includes all sort of other things. And whenever the price, if I have to drive to Cairo to buy a loaf of bread, for example, I'm not going to do that. Even if bread is free in Cairo, I'm not going to drive there, because the cost of getting there is just too expensive. Now that brings me to a very important thing, and I'm just using taxes as an example here. So whenever you introduce some sort of friction, making it difficult for the buyer and the seller to trade with one another, this free lunch disappears. Now what I've done, I've introduced a tax as an example here. So if the moment you introduce a tax into this equation, in other words, you add to the cost of doing a transaction with one another, the price of producing a loaf of bread goes up. And of course, the politicians take that part. But the free lunch part that we created out of nothing, that part there now becomes a dead weight loss. We lose it completely. Now, this is important. If you understand economics, you understand this is the key to economic growth, is that you have to allow for private property rights, you have to allow for trade, and you have to make it easy for people to trade, and you have to remove obstacles in the way of trade. Because the moment you add any kind of obstacle to trade, like a tax, for example, it leads to a dead weight loss, and not even the politicians get that. It's a free lunch that disappears. That's the point I want to make. Now that's important because I'm going to show you how to compile, how to put together an ideal tax system just a little bit later. Now the result of all this, the result of private property rights, the result of trading, the result of the discovery of money, the result of what we've done, all these things that we've put together, the result of that was absolutely astonishing. If you go back, this is absolute poverty over time. If you go back to the year 1820 as an example, now there are many different ways of measuring absolute poverty. But in the 1820s as an example, in some, depending on how you measure that, but more than 90% of the world lived in absolute poverty. Now absolute poverty means you go to bed hungry. Today, this is a World Bank study, today less than 10% of the world's population live in absolute poverty. We won the war against poverty. And within 10 or 20 years, poverty will not exist on this planet anymore, with one or two exceptions, of course. But we won the war. This is astonishing what we've achieved here. This is absolutely amazing what we've achieved. I can give you many other numbers. 100 years ago, life expectancy in the rich world was around about 45. Today, it's easily double that. 100 years ago, 45% of all kids died before the age of 5. Today, it's less than 5%. So quite often we complain, rightfully so, about being South Africans and things that are going wrong in South Africa. But if you stand back a little bit, our progress was just absolutely amazing. And it is because of those simple things. The protection, the value of private property rights, trade, and the reduction of the cost of doing business with one another, which, by the way, includes money, and which I believe over time that the private money will probably take it the next step and make it even easier for individuals to trade with one another, leading to even more wealth creation. This is absolute poverty in some areas in the world. So the whole world is basically down to zero. So South Asia, that's that one over here. This is Sub-Saharan Africa. So Africa is around about 40% absolute poverty level. Still, there's a prediction on what, this is a World Bank prediction on what's going to happen until the year 2030. So absolute poverty will disappear in the rest of the world. This is Africa. Africa's absolute poverty levels will mostly remain intact or may even increase a little bit. And I've got some ideas why that is the case, why it is that Africa's poverty levels remain relatively high. But that's not the purpose of this presentation tonight. If there are questions a little bit later, we can talk about that. It's just another graph to show more or less the same. This is a logarithmic scale. So forget about the scale, that's not important. On this selected countries, the richest country in the world on a per capita PPP basis, purchasing power parity basis, the United States, just a few selected countries. This is South Africa. We've been flat for a couple of years, for about 5 years on a per capita basis in South Africa. I mean, things are not going well in South Africa and a couple of other. But the reason I'm showing you this, look at the Chinese. That was absolutely astonishing what the Chinese have achieved the past 3 years. The increase on the per capita wealth in China, we have never seen in the history of mankind so much wealth creation. And it seems to me as if this wealth creation, this process of wealth creation is picking up momentum, and we're creating even more and even more and even more wealth. And there are just some examples. I also believe, by the way, that the next one, that's India over there. The next country that is going to be the growth engine of the world is probably going to be India. I believe it's the Indians that's going to be the next China. They're going to take over from the Chinese. Okay, so that brings me then, maybe I can just make a comment on this before I go to the optimal tax system. If you look at economists, economists are people that really go out of their ways to try to make things as complicated as possible. Economists don't really understand economics, and that includes me, by the way. I also do not understand economics. Economists make use of all sorts of numbers to try to understand what is going on in the economy. Like, for example, a very important number that economists quite often try to calculate is GDP, economic growth. What is included in the economy? And we cannot agree. We cannot agree what should be included in the economy. That's for that reason I prefer to use some other measurement of success. Like, for example, life expectancy. We all want to live a long life. So I think life expectancy is a better measure of economic success than say anything, many of these other measures that are used. But if we look at the conventional numbers, the conventional way of measuring the success of an economy, or the conventional way of measuring the temperature in an economy, let me give you one or two examples where I believe that something is wrong and I don't know really what it is. I've got a suspicion, but I'm not 100% sure. If we look at the United States economy, the US economy at the moment, the US economy is roughly growing at about 2% or so, which is not very strong, but it is a very, very big economy in the world, and 2% growth is not too bad. But the interesting thing about the US economy is that the inflation numbers in the United States, the inflation is very low, below 2% at the moment, but at the same time, unemployment levels are very low in the United States. Now that doesn't make sense. If you look at normal economic theory, the way that economists look at economies, it doesn't make sense. It's not right, because that's not what the books told us. The books told us if you have low levels of unemployment, then the demand in the economy will be relatively strong, and that will lead to high price increases or high inflation. So you will always find that these two things move in the opposite direction. What we have now, we have very low unemployment and very low inflation, as an example, in the United States. And at the same time, very low levels of interest rates in the United States. Why is that so? I don't know why that is so. But maybe what is going on is that we underestimate the effect of what is called the fourth industrial revolution. So maybe the economies in the United States is actually bigger than what we thought up to now. And maybe productivity growth is actually much stronger in the United States than what we thought up to now. So maybe things like, for example, cell phones and the gig economy and all this technological stuff, and maybe all of that is actually contributing to economic growth much more than what we economists can actually measure. And maybe over time somebody will win the Nobel Prize on how to measure the size of the economy, because we don't know, to be quite honest and to be quite frank. So that's just a side comment of economics. But getting back to the optimal tax system, remember, so we want to build a tax system, we want to keep this free lunches. We want to build some sort of tax system that is not going to add or to create this dead weight lost in the economy. We want free lunches to be created, and we want that to happen in trade. So let's have a look at the ideal tax system, or the closest that we can get to an ideal tax system. But before you get to an ideal tax system, you have to ask the question, what is a country? Now, this is what I believe. I don't believe countries really exist. I don't think a place like South Africa really exists. I think a country is just a geographic area. A country is, some other people may recognize this as South Africa or as a country. Countries quite often have armies and they have their own currencies. But essentially, a country is nothing but an agreement between individuals that we are going to call this place South Africa. That's what it is. It's just an agreement. And you find it, and it's happening all the time, like 2 or 3 years ago, whatever, there was one country called Sudan, and the next day there were 2 countries, Sudan and South Sudan. Even in South Africa, we had 4 countries in 1910, and the next day we've got 1 country called South Africa. So countries do not really exist. And by the way, the same goes for companies. Companies also don't exist. Companies is just a group of people that with a certain agreement between them, and they decide to work together for their mutual benefit. So, but anyway, so a country, I don't really believe that countries really exist. It's a man-made thing, and we can change that as well. And that's important because I believe there's a very good chance that South Africa can fall apart politically as well, given the state of our state's finances, and I'll get to that a little bit later. All right, so what is the role of the state? That depends on what you believe in. And there are 2 extreme views on what the state or a country should do. And of course, the politicians or the government has been put there by us to run this thing that we call a country. So we create a state to run our country for us. And it really depends on your ideology, and there are 2 possibilities. Either a centrally controlled system, which is known as a communist system, or a free market, or sometimes called the capitalist kind of system. So those are the 2 extremes, or something in between. The difference between these 2 things are essentially the question about the ownership of factors of production. So who owns it? Is it the private sector that owns it, or does it belong to everybody? And I, of course, prefer it when it belongs to the individuals and not to everybody, because the moment something belongs to everybody, it belongs to nobody. And then there's a very important question. If you decide, once you've decided, okay, things should belong to the private sector, to individuals, or it should belong to the state, it doesn't matter. You still have to make the decision. You have to still make the call how to allocate resources. And I'll get to that. And I think that's an important one. I would just spend a little bit some time on that. I just want to make 1 or 2 comments about the democracy. What is a democracy? People think a democracy is majority decision making, where the majority decides. That is not what a democracy is. A democracy is never absolute. If the majority decide that all blonde people should do hard labor, whatever, that's nothing to do with democracy. And in fact, there are some tests that can actually determine which of those decisions should be collective decisions and which not. And I want to share some of these. And that comes back to the economy just now. So there's a test on what should be collectively decided, or what should be decided in a democratic system and which not. And the test is simply collective goods should be decided about collectively, in other words, should be part of a democratic process, but non-collective goods should not be part of the democratic process. And it's quite easy to make a distinction between collective and non-collective goods. And the principle of exclusion is very important here. Now let me give you an example. It is impossible, as an example, to exclude somebody from getting the benefits of defense. Because whether you like this or not, and whether they're doing a good job or not, it doesn't matter. If you live in this place called South Africa, you will be defended by the South African Defence Force. And you cannot exclude somebody from being defended. And that's one of those things then that should be part of the democratic process. We should, as a collective, as a democratic country, decide about things like, for example, defense. And here are the primary things that the state should provide. And that's defense. And of course, there are always somebody that will disagree with me, but this is the classical view. The state should be responsible for defense and police and the judiciary. These are the primary functions of the state. Of course, it's not a black and white thing. There are some grey areas, and here are some grey areas. Some people may argue that the state should provide infrastructure, as an example, although it's possible to exclude people from infrastructure. I can, for example, tell you, listen, you're not allowed to use this bridge. I can exclude you from the use of a bridge, as an example, and therefore infrastructure or the provision of infrastructure should actually be the responsibility of the private sector. But quite a lot of people will argue that infrastructure is part of what the state's responsibility, and other things like, for example, education and health and the like. So there's certainly a lot of grey areas. Nobody can argue. If you really believe that the state should provide collective goods, then nobody can argue, because you can't really push this definition so far that you include things like, for example, airways. There's no, if you believe in a democratic process and you believe in a free market system, there's absolutely no argument why the state should own certain businesses, and I think an airline is an excellent example of that. But there are arguments why the state should provide, for example, education. There's a lot of grey areas. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So you've got all this thing that the state is supposed to be doing. So how are you going to fund this? And this is coming back to an ideal tax system. Keeping in mind, we want to keep on harvesting all these free lunches. So what is the ideal tax system for the state? What should it look like? The easiest way for the state to fund the states, whatever the state decides to do, is to get people to pay for that. But then then it's not a collective good anymore. But it's a user charge is an obvious way to fund the state. So if the state builds a toll road, for example, tolls is a good way of funding that. And that's by the way, part of the reason why I'm in favor, in principle, of the toll roads in South Africa. But if you can't use that, then of course you have to use taxes. And the requirement for taxes, or the requirement for a good tax, of course there's no such thing as a good tax, but there are bad taxes and then worse taxes. So what are some of the requirements of a good tax system? The most obvious thing is that you must be able to collect some money. So that's a requirement. You must be able to get some money out of whatever you decide to do. It must be relatively efficient. It doesn't make sense if the collection process is more expensive than the amount of money that you're going to collect. And by the way, there are some taxes like that in South Africa, where it costs us more to collect it than actually the money that we've collected. And it must efficient and cost effective. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I want to spend time on two things. There's also a so-called equality principle. That means everybody must pay the same, whatever that means. And it must be non-distortive. It must be neutral. The requirement of neutrality in a tax. And I want to spend some time on that. But let me just get to the equality principle. The equality principle simply means What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Now here are some levels of equality, because equality is just not equality. Equality's got levels of equalities as well. So there's an absolute level of equality, and that means if a tax is absolutely equal, it means everybody pays exactly the same. For example, everybody pays 10,000 Rand per month to the state by way of a poll tax, whether you've got an income or not, whether you've got a job or not, doesn't matter, we all pay 10,000 Rand and that's it. And we had that in South Africa some time ago. So that was quite popular. The British like to use poll taxes in their colonies. So that's an absolute equal tax. That is a relatively good tax. Not a good tax, but it's a less bad tax. It's a less bad tax because it does not affect the allocation of resources in an economy. I'll get back to that a little bit later. So that's an absolute equal tax. A relatively equal tax is we all pay 10% of our income, as an example. So it's not absolutely equal, but it's relatively equal in that we all pay 10% of our income to the state. So I guess there could be some argument why that is also a good tax. And then the third possibility of a tax is a progressive equality. Now that is a contradiction. There's no proper, in philosophy or in theory, there's no proper arguments for a progressive tax, and that's exactly what we have in South Africa. It's highly distortive. So that's a question about equality. Then tax neutrality and only free lunch. Okay, what do we have? We've got ownership, one of those major economic breakthroughs when we first established this thing called something belongs to me. When we discovered that we can exchange it with somebody else, we created a real free lunches, and of course the more transaction cost came down, the more we traded with one another. And for that reason, it's important for taxes to be neutral, not to affect or influence the trade between individuals, not to encourage or discourage people to trade with one another. And that's a part of the reason, by the way, why many economists say that taxes like, for example, the so-called sin taxes are bad things, because you simply add an additional cost between the buyer and the seller, and that makes it more difficult for people to trade. And it's not for us to say whether it's good or bad to smoke or to drink. That's not, it's not a business for politicians. I feel happy when I have something to drink, as an example. Okay, so I just want to touch a little bit on the fiscal matrix, and I'm going to give you some numbers on what's going on in South Africa. Okay, this is the state's revenue. With that background on taxes, let's see where we get the money from in South Africa. 40% of taxes in South Africa comes from personal income taxes. Personal income taxes is nothing but a tax on labor. And remember, labor is just a product that we are selling. This is hugely and massively disruptive to the process of buying and selling of labor in South Africa, because we put this huge tax, this huge obstacle in the way between the buyer and the seller, making labor relatively expensive and make for the buyer, and making labor relatively cheap for the seller, for the worker, and it is because of taxes. The second one is value-added taxes. Now, let me admit, I'll be honest about this. I used to be a big supporter of value-added taxes. And in a way, I'm still kind of prefer value-added tax before a personal income tax, as an example. But clearly, that's a very obvious example of a tax that is placed between the buyer and the seller. And value-added taxes reduce directly the free lunch that is created when buyers and sellers do transactions with one another. The third most important tax is that one over there, and that's personal income. That is company taxes, and company taxes do not really exist because companies don't pay taxes, because companies don't exist. It's simply a group of individuals, and that is nothing but another tax that should be added to personal income taxes. Now, the purest form of tax is a poll tax, as I've mentioned earlier, and we don't have any of those in any one of these taxes. In fact, in total, there are more than 100 taxes here. The most important one, personal income tax, value-added tax, and company taxes over there. This is where the money goes to. Remember, the job of the state, the primary functions of the state is defense, the police, and the judiciary, and maybe some other things like, for example, infrastructure. So the primary functions of the state, economic affairs, where's the public order, that one over there, it's that one over there, and a couple of those. So the total state spending that goes to the primary functions in the state in South Africa is between, say, 10 and 20% in South Africa. The secondary functions, the most important one is that one over there, and that is education. Followed by that one over there, certain public services, and that one about which one, that's social protection, that's the different grants and so on. So the bulk of South Africa's government spending doesn't even go to the things that they're supposed to be spending money on. It goes to other things that's got some political or social objectives behind that. This is just a long-term trend of those two two set of numbers. I just got this information a little while ago, going back to 1961, the beginning of the Republic of South Africa, when state spending was approximately 16% of GDP, 16% of the economy. Today's state spending is equal to double that, 32% of the economy. So within a matter of nearly 60 years, state spending in relative terms doubled. So the state today is double the size it was in 1961. And the primary reason why we've seen this huge increase in state spending has to do with an increase on social kind of spending, non-primary stuff, non-things that the state is supposed to be spending money on. If we look at the short term, the past 10 years or so, there was another huge increase in state spending, and that was primarily, well, on two things. On social expenditure of some kind of or another, and a huge increase in the wage bill in South Africa, and a number of civil servants that are being paid by us. Note, I did not say work, but being paid by us. In total, there are 22 million people that receives money from the state every month. Let me repeat it. Every month, 22 million people receive money from the state. And there are 16 million people with jobs, by the way. Okay. So 22 million. They are either social grant recipients, or they work for the state, or they work for parasitals. So 22 million people. So there was a huge increase, and the reason for this huge increase, of course, is because of COSATU, part of the tripartite alliance, putting a lot of pressure on the Minister of Finance, mostly Pravin Gordhan, to employ more civil servants and to completely overpay them. In the meantime, that's state revenue. Let me just make a comment. State revenue is the collections of the various taxes, but actually when you talk about state revenue or the tax burden on the economy, you should be talking about the red line, because that needs to be funded eventually. You fund it in the short term by borrowing money on the so-called fiscal deficit, so you postpone your taxes, but if you really talk about the tax burden, it's the red line, not the blue line, but nevertheless. So the blue line is how much money we've been collecting in the recent years. And the interesting thing is the reason for this increase in the tax burden in recent years has to do with an increase in the various taxes. So we had an increase in value-added taxes, we had an increase in personal income taxes, we had the introduction of a lot of new taxes and so on. And in fact, if you strip out the actual increase in the tax rates, then the tax collections actually fell in recent years. And the reason for that has to do, amongst others, has to do with people actively trying to evade this increase in the tax burden. People are doing their utmost not to pay taxes. I'm an asset manager, and I advise people on finances and structures and stuff like that. And when they walk into my office, the first thing they always say, I don't want to pay taxes. It doesn't matter what. You do whatever you can, but you don't let me pay any more taxes. I've had enough. So the only increase, the reason for the increase, relatively speaking, is because of new taxes or increase in the tax rates that we've seen. We've had a huge gap between the two, and that's the money that they have been borrowing. That's a fiscal accounts. This is a fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit in the current financial year, the Minister of Finance will be, next week, the Minister of Finance will deliver his so-called mini-budget or the medium-term budget policy statement, which is not a budget, it's just a report-back opportunity for the Minister of Finance. My expectation is that the fiscal deficit in the current financial year is going to exceed 6% of GDP, the deficit. The economy is growing not at 1%, at 0.5%, but let's say it's 1%. Here's a party trick. You go to a party, you meet somebody, an economist from another country, you ask him, what's your debt to GDP? In South Africa's case, it is, let's call it, start off with 55% of GDP. Then you ask him, what's your economic growth? Then in the case of South Africa, it will be 1%. Then you ask him, what's your fiscal deficit? In the case of South Africa, it's 6%. Then you tell him your debt to GDP ratio will go up by another 5% this year. It's easy to do. 6% deficit to GDP, 1% economic growth, debt will go up by 5%. So you add that to the previous level. So every year, in the current scenario, South Africa's debt to GDP will keep on going up at the rate of at least 5%. And also keep in mind, last year it also went up by 5%. So we have to pay this year interest on last year's debt that we've accumulated as well. And next year, on last year and on this debt, additional debt. So the debt in South Africa just keeps on going up. In the current financial year, debt in excess of 6% to GDP, because of two reasons: because we have to keep on bailing out Eskom, and because tax collections is probably going to be about 60 billion rand or so below the original budgeted estimates. Okay, so that's the debt to GDP ratio. It happened primarily when that guy, Pravin Gordhan, was the Minister of Finance. He's a good guy. I don't think he's a thief. I don't think he had his fingers in a cookie jar, but he's a communist, and this increase in state debt happened when he was the Minister of Finance. State debt today is at 60% to GDP, and at the end of the financial year, remember the state's financial year starts on a very appropriate date, the 1st of April. So the end of March, state debt, with this party trick that I've showed you, state debt to GDP will exceed 62% to GDP, and I'm only talking about national government. It will exceed 62% of GDP in the current financial year. So I expect another 5% to GDP will be added to this debt mountain again. And that's part of the reason why I actually expect a downgrade by Moody's, or at least a negative, putting us on a negative watch by Moody's next month when they meet again. So that's what's been happening on It's completely unsustainable. It's not the level that's important, it's the change in the level. That is important. Okay, now the Minister of Finance, whenever you listen to the Minister, I thought of just mentioning what is debt, what is that thing called debt, and that's the definition I'm using here is a definition, World Bank and IMF definition, also definition used by the South African Reserve Bank, but there are other forms of debt. The Minister, for example, he will use that debt, it's called gross debt, it's only national department's debt, and they will deduct available cash balances, and it really depends on what balances you're talking about. But typically, you will deduct the money, the balances at the Reserve Bank or the tax and loan accounts at the banks and so on, and you get to a net debt number, which is 2 or 3% lower than the gross debt number. But we have to include the state-owned enterprises debt as well, Eskom's outstanding debt. Only Eskom is 450 billion rand, so we can add another 10% to GDP to our existing debt. So if you add the state-owned enterprises, then debt is actually well in excess of 70% to GDP. And then some other things that we could add to that as well, like, for example, the unemployment insurance fund, the road accident fund, and that sort of stuff, which are all, well, not the road accident fund at least is running at a huge deficit. So it really depends what your definition of debt is. I've only looked at that one, gross debt. You can include, and you should include some of the others as well. So here's my ideal poll tax. And I'm trying to be a little bit pragmatic, but the least bad tax, that is the least disruptive tax, is a poll tax, which is very difficult to implement. Ask Margaret Thatcher. But to be realistic, in the case of South Africa, I will actually include 4 other taxes as well. Or in fact, poll taxes are not going to fly, forget about that, so let's be realistic about that. But I will introduce a personal income tax, but I will only have 3 income categories, and I will make it lower than where it is. So 3 income categories, make it much easier, no deductions whatsoever, including no deductions for savings for retirement, including no deductions, for example, medical funds and that sort of stuff. No deductions, 3 income tax categories, and the reason why I want to do that, because that's a political reality in South Africa. We have to redistribute. And I know that Leon is going to take me on this one, but that's the political reality. And I also don't agree with that. I would also introduce some sort of indirect tax, like, for example, a VAT. And I do understand and I agree that the VAT is a bad tax because it makes it more difficult to trade. But again, you have to get the money somewhere. And a VAT is probably less bad than having a company tax. So I will also introduce an indirect tax, like, for example, VAT. The fuel levy is also a bad tax. The fuel levy is relatively easy to collect, and I will actually increase the fuel levy. And then I will also keep some sin taxes, like, for example, on cigarettes and so on, just to keep the greenies happy. Not because I believe in that, but that is perhaps the best kind of compromise if you want to compile a tax system in South Africa. Okay, we can talk about that. I just wanted to make some of those comments. All right, now the question I want to ask is, and this is actually what's next? Where are we going to go next? We started off with nothing. with a very low life expectancy. Life was very, very hard. So what's going to happen next? What sort of system can we expect next? What's life going to look like next? And I don't know, but here are a couple of ideas, and I would like to hear what you guys think about that. Is it possible, perhaps, that artificial intelligence can provide another way? We've got two systems that we understand, and some stuff in between, a collectivized system or a communist system and a free market system or a capitalist system and a couple of systems in between. Is there a third possibility? Could there be something else? And the reason why I asked this question is because I came across an amazing program. Now, I'm not a very good athlete. I'm actually quite a bad athlete. And I need, if I want to run a marathon, I need to really exercise quite a lot. But I don't really know what to do, really. Because I get somebody that help me, give me a program, and we go in the internet and you get a program on what to do. But it never really works out for me. And sometimes I cannot go for a run in the morning, or sometimes I've got a little bit more time, or whatever the case might be. You never get a program that fits whatever you want to do 100%. Then I came across a program called Train as One. Go and check this out. Now, I read about this in the Financial Times. Now, what this program does, they get all your basic information. How old you are, how fit you are, what your goals are, what you want to achieve, your weight, and everything. And you also give access to my Garmin stuff. So whenever I run, I update all this information, my pace that I've run, how far I've run, the temperature, my heart rate, all that sort of stuff. And you also give them access to your running data. Then they take all this information and they look at other people's running data, and through computers and through artificial intelligence, they work out the optimal training regime for me. And this is absolutely astonishing. And what I found out is that sometimes I've been overtraining. So no individual has the capacity or understands me as well as that computer, because this computer has got a lot of data behind it, and this computer can use all this information, and this computer can calculate the optimal training regime for me. And when I wake up one morning and I've got a bit of a bubble and I do not want to go for a run, and I don't go for a run, it will redo the whole thing and give me another program. In fact, this computer can actually pick up that my heart rate has been picking up a little bit the last day or 2, 3, and there's a possibility that I may be coming down with a flu, and it can even adjust for that as well. Okay, it is amazing what people are doing out there. So this is artificial intelligence. Now, why is this important? Because it's a question about information. And there are 3 ways of looking at this, or 3 things, or 3 possibilities of getting the right information and doing the right calculations to allocate resources. You can make use of a free market system, which is called a capitalist system sometimes, a centrally controlled system, which is called a communist system, or you can maybe, and this is what I've been thinking about, make use of computers to do exactly that, because that is exactly what my program is doing for me, to give me the optimal program on how to exercise to get ready for a marathon I'm planning to run next week. Okay, let's look at the basic problem. So the basic problem in economics is, remember first we established something called private property rights, and then we started to specialize. So I'm specializing in producing cattle, for example, but I can't just live on cattle. I want to exchange my cattle for something else. So I must ask the question, how many cattle I must produce, or how many sheep I must produce, or whatever the case may be. Or if I have a factory, what must I make? Must I make pumpkin color shoes or blue shoes? I don't know. So what must I make? How much of whatever I decide to make, how much of that should I produce? And of course, at what price? Now, this is very important because this is the key difference between a communist system and a capitalist system. And let me get to that. So, in a free market system, supply and demand forces keep on changing continuously. And it's a process that never stops. It's chaotic, but it's dynamic. It's never ending. There's never an equilibrium, despite the graph that I've showed you. There's never really an equilibrium. And that the signals that we're getting from the change in supply and demand are the changes in prices. And that's the big difference between a free market system and that of a communist system. In a communist system, all these inputs were completely different. In this system, a free market system, it's never optimal, Because the moment you get to an equilibrium, that's outdated already, and we're looking for the next equilibrium. So it's always outdated. We're always trying to find the truth, and it's always just one step ahead of us. And you will never get to an optimal system, but it is probably as best as we can get. The alternative that the communists tried, they said, no, let's look at this differently, the whole process. We have to decide what we're going to manufacture, what we want, and it's easy to know what we want. We ask the politicians. We want rockets, things that are of national importance, national priorities. We want rockets, and we want collective housing, and we want big cars for the politicians. Those are the national priorities. So once we know what we want and the politicians decide that, it's not the people, the politicians that are in charge of this decide that, then you give this information to committees. And the committees, and I promise you, if you give a lot of information and decision-making powers to a bunch of economists sitting in a committee, like the committee that the president just appointed, you're going to get a total misallocation of resources. And that's exactly what happened in the old Soviet Union. So economists will know what the goal is, what the priorities are, and they will allocate existing resources. They are in charge of that. They will allocate resources. They will always over or under-allocate, and it always leads to a huge misallocation of resources. And that's the reason why communism cannot work, because the allocation of resources is always suboptimal. If they get it right, it's just luck for a moment. Even in a free market system, we can't get it right. We're continuously trying to find the next optimal allocation of resources. And it keeps on getting away from us. We keep on chasing this goal. In a communist system, they will never ever. If they do that, it's only luck. It's only luck for that one moment. It always leads to misallocation of resources, and it always leads to this free lunch that cannot be created in a communist system. Artificial intelligence is different. There's this massive available tool of data. Let me just say something about artificial intelligence. It's not intelligence as we understand this. It's not a machine with emotions. It's not a machine that becomes human. It's something different. And the artificial intelligence is about one thing only, and that's brute processing power. You can give a machine a lot of data, and the machine can chow up all this data and go through and pick up all patterns in this data. And that is what artificial intelligence is all about. It can lead potentially to a much better allocation of resources. It's much more dynamic, and it's even forward-looking. Even better. Remember, a capitalist system is always backward-looking. Where were the prices yesterday? So that's why it's important for me to produce, because I assume the price is going to be the same. Tomatoes were expensive yesterday, so let me assume tomatoes are going to be expensive tomorrow as well. Artificial intelligence does not do that. They will look at you and say, listen, you haven't trained today, you have to train a little bit more tomorrow. So it adjusts that automatically. It will look at your heart rate. Your heart rate has been going up. I have to produce a little bit more coughing medicine, because chances are a lot of people will start getting a cold. I have to produce more medicine for tomorrow. And before I get into too much trouble with Leon, let me just say, maybe artificial intelligence should not be seen as the third way, but as an additional tool in the hands of individuals of the private sector to allocate the resources even better. So perhaps that's the best of answer. So, but that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question I want to ask. Is that perhaps the future? Is that where we're going to end? Where we will get computers that will make many of these very important decisions. But whatever happens in future, I don't know what it is, but based on what's been happening the past couple of thousand years, what's been happening the past 100 years, what's been happening the past 30 years, the trajectory is only one direction. It's for a better life, a longer life, and a much wealthier life for all of us. I'm pretty sure the next 100 years are going to be even better than what we've seen the past couple of, decades and millennia in the world. Just a few comments about South Africa, if you guys are interested. I'm not going to spend too much if there are questions about this. Economic growth in South Africa, this is just my expectations. My expectations for economic growth is around about 1%, and a bad year down to 0.5%, and a good year up to 1.5% or so. But we in this growth trajectory, a very, very low growth trajectory of about 1%. population growth is 1.6%. So that's why unemployment will keep on going up, poverty will keep on going up. CPI, inflation rate, I expect it around about 4.5%. It's likely to stay there or even a little bit lower. But Lesetja Kganyago is doing an excellent job. He's a conservative, he's a real hawk, so he's keeping interest rates a little bit on the high side, and he's trying to anchor inflation expectations around about 4.5% or even lower. Inflation just came out today at 4.1%. So inflation, I'm not concerned about inflation, at least not in the short term. The bonds, the yields in South Africa, and I did say that I expect a downgrade. Now, how is that possible? That the yields currently are about just over 8% on a 10-year bonds in South Africa. I expect that to come down to say 7.5 or 7% or so. Remember, in the rest of the world, yields in Europe, $12 trillion worth of bonds internationally are currently trading at a yield below zero. That means if you want to lend money to the Germans, you have to pay them for the privilege of lending the money. That's what it means. South Africa's got a yield of about 8%. We've got an exchange rate, a currency that is hugely undervalued. So the moment we get, this is what I think is going to happen. The moment we get a downgrade, which I expect, South Africa's financial markets are very liquid, well regulated, much integrated with the rest of the world. So we get a downgrade. You've got a cheap currency, so the entrance to the foreigners is very cheap. You can enter South Africa very cheaply, and you can invest in a wonderful bond yield. So I've got a suspicion, get a downgrade, the normal institutional investors will take the money out of South Africa, leading initially to a weaker currency. Then the speculator is going to say, but this must be an opportunity. And I think the speculators are going to come in, leading to a much more volatile currency, but don't necessarily expect the rand to go necessarily weaker in the short term, or much weaker if there is a downgrade. And that's because of this very, very juicy bond yields that we offer in South Africa. Okay, so the rest of the world, you can't get any return in the rest of the world. You get a nice return, very importantly, in the liquid market. So that's part of the reason why I expect yields to come down. The prime interest rate, that's coming down a little bit. I expect that to be. And the rand also in the short term, it's possible for the rand to appreciate a little bit. I'm not sure about that. Nobody really can forecast the exchange rate of the currency. And over the medium, longer term, the rand will just keep on one direction. That's for a weaker currency. As long as you have a bad government like what we have, the economy will not perform, and the rand will take the knock for that. Okay, just a few other comments about one or two other things. Eskom, they will turn that into the three, that should be units. 3 units. I agree with that. But what you need to do, of course, you have to take the next step. Breaking Eskom into 3 units is only the first step. The 3 units will be transmission, generation, transmission, and distribution. I'm always in favor of privatization. It cannot happen with Eskom anymore because they've destroyed Eskom. There's nothing to sell anymore. So on the generation side, the best that you can do is just to allow private sector to start their own power stations. Transmission is a natural monopoly. Maybe you can send it out for the private sector to manage that, but you can't really privatize the transmission part. And the distribution side, you can maybe get private sector participation in them, and then municipalities will lose a huge chunk of their income. Eskom is a problem that cannot be solved. I don't know how we're going to fix this. Just by the way, legislation has just been passed, I think today, for this additional 59 billion rand that's going to be transferred to Eskom. Now, the Minister of Treasury did say, I will give you this 59 billion rand extra, but under certain conditions. And the conditions are A, B, and C. You have to sell this, you have to do this, you have to provide this, and so on and so on. None of those conditions are included in the legislation that was approved today. So they're going to get the 59 billion rand and do whatever they want to do with it. That's essentially what it comes down to. So you cannot fix this thing anymore. I think Tito Mboweni must be pulling out his hair. I can't see how he's going to stay around for much longer. NHI, it's too expensive. The civil servants will not allow that because they also mostly, they've got good medical services. Then if you change this to NHI, everything will be turned into the private or to the public sector, which is a total disaster. But the good thing of having an incompetent government is that they cannot implement good things, but they also cannot implement bad things. So it's a bad idea that will not be implemented. It will not happen, the NHI will not happen. Some other issues, prescribed assets, there's a good possibility that we may eventually see prescribed assets, I'm afraid to say. The Reserve Bank, there's huge pressure on the South African Reserve Bank. That debated a little bit recently. That brilliant economist called Mr. H. Magashule, he suggested that we should start something called quality easing or something and change the mandate of the Reserve Bank. Don't believe me, in a couple of years' time, the pressure on the Reserve Bank will be back again. This is not the end of this. And expropriation, I think that will happen. It's important for the ANC to implement this and to expropriate, to actually expropriate, and they're probably going to expropriate 1 or 2 farms or whatever. It's not about farms or land, it's about private property rights, by the way, which is that first thing that we started. So they're undermining private property rights, and I think they will expropriate 1 or 2 properties, and they have to do that for symbolic purposes at least. But that's not my main concern, the state expropriating property. I'm much more concerned about the mobs just taking people's property and the police not doing their job and taking people off properties. That's a much bigger threat as far as I'm concerned. How to destroy now? Leo Tolstoy, he wrote the book Anna Karenina. That's my claim to fame. I've read Anna Karenina. It's this bigger, thicker book. And my wife forced me to read Anna Karenina. That's really tough. It's a little small print, the thick book. It's really a wonderful book, actually, but it was tough to read that. And the first sentence in Anna Karenina is that all happy families are happy in the same way, and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And that, in a way, is true. It's easy. We know what the formula is for a country to get rich. It's not difficult to see that. Just see what successful countries did and do the same. The formula is there. We can be happy, like other happy countries. But every country is going to be unhappy in their own way. And people ask me, are we going to be the same as Zimbabwe? And the answer is no. We're going to be the same as South Africa. We're going to be different. But we're going to be unhappy. And we're not going to be like Venezuela. We're also going to be unhappy. In fact, we are unhappy at the moment. Per capita GDP is coming down, as an example, for 5 years now. Unemployment keeps on going up. But what you do pick up quite often is that there's a certain pattern that is followed for all unhappy countries to become unhappy. And here's the pattern. Politicians, they start off by destroying the existing capital, or they try. Eskom, they've destroyed Eskom. That's an example of capital that has been destroyed. Because they need money. They've got a lot of promises. They've got a lot of ideas. They need money, I've showed you. So they need to get money somewhere and spend money on stuff. And one of the ways of spending money on stuff is not to spend money on things that are important, like, for example, infrastructure and the maintenance of infrastructure. Eskom, again, so you destroy your capital. That's one thing that typically happens. There are many examples of that. Then you frighten your taxpayers, and you frighten your taxpayers by keep on increasing taxes. And we've done that already. Even if we increase taxes further, you're not going to get much out of the taxpayer. It's totally overburdened already. Then you start scaring your savers by by prescribed assets as an example, which is obviously part of the ANC's manifesto. And then in the end, it always ends the same. And that is that you've got this huge mountain of debt. You cannot take money from the taxpayers anymore because you ran out of taxpayers. You can't take money from the savers anymore. You ran out of savers. And then the only thing that really remains is to inflate yourself out of debt. Remember, inflation reduces the value of money, but it also reduces the value of debt. And that's the reason why the ANC wants to get hold of the South African Reserve Bank. Because if you can get hold of the Reserve Bank, you can get rid of your debt as well. And by the way, there's an amount of about 500 billion rand at the South African Reserve Bank of unrealized profits that whoever is in charge of the Reserve Bank can, in a way, legitimately get from the South African Reserve Bank. So that's one reason why there's a huge pressure on the Reserve Bank and why the pressure is going to return, the political pressure on the South African Reserve Bank. And these sort of parties, where we are today, where this destructive government that we have in South Africa, it always ends the same. And that's with very high levels of inflation. Not in the next 2-3 years, especially not with Lesetja Kganyago, but eventually that is where these sort of parties eventually end. So, inflation, apart from that, inflation is also very bad because it distorts the signals in the economy. We don't know how to allocate resources. So what to do? My advice to people is to understand what is going on, get information, make sure you try to identify your risks, try to manage your risk as well as you possibly can, which includes, I take my clients' money out of South Africa, but you have to stay in South Africa. The returns in South Africa are very high. So if you can identify your risk and manage your risk, then the profit is pretty much a given because there are very amazing opportunities in South Africa, but you have to be able to manage your risk. I'm done nearly. But in a more basic, what you need to do is that if you're really interested in this place that we call South Africa, the best that you can do, and the best that we can do, all of us do, to make sure that we have a successful and a rich country, is to become successful ourselves as individuals, to become rich as an individual, and to put yourself always first as an individual. Because if we do these sort of things, then the country will become that as well. And I always advise people not to break any taxes, but to pay any laws, but to pay as little tax as possible. Thank you very much for listening. Sure. Does it take questions?
Can you take questions?
Of course. Any questions?
Manage it.
Yes, I will do that. Yes, sir.
If you take a look at Eskom, where you say it can't be fixed, not to sell it as a going concern, but to sell off the individual generation units and take the money that you realise from that, pay off the Eskom debt, and then have each of the generation units compete against each other so that they bring down the cost of electricity and possibly keep the country going using that particular method, and have the transmission as a constant and fair access to all types of electricity, Eskom, renewables, or that sort of thing. Would that sort of thing work?
Yes. Well, yeah, it will, except for the selling off of the generation parts. Because, and I'm not an expert in this, I'm just using what other people told me. And the clever people tell me that between 20 and 25% of the power stations will be decommissioned within the next 5 years or so. So they're just too old. You cannot put, and I don't understand all of this, but there's not much that you can do with the majority of the power stations. So nobody's going to buy it because the amount of capital that you need to put in that thing to sort of modernize it is just not worth it. The modern ones, like Kisule and Mudupe, nobody will be interested in paying for them what we as the taxpayer paid for them, because they 2 or 3 times over budget. There's just no way that anybody will pay that sort of money. And if Eskom sells it at the correct price, we're talking about hundreds of billions of rands of capital loss that will be realized immediately. So that's also not an option. So you cannot sell off the generation part of Eskom. As a free marketeer myself, of course, I would like that to happen. But I think on a generation part, the best that we can do is just to allow the private sector to do their own thing and start producing electricity with their own power stations that they build themselves. But I agree with the transmission part that you can concession it out under control of the private sector, like toll roads as an example, and then get them to buy whatever electricity from the cheapest generator. And it doesn't matter whether it's Eskom or the private sector. Yes. Yes, sir.
Some countries, for example, like Bulgaria, introduced a flat tax system where they pay 10% on individuals, corporates and dividends. And that has been in existence for about a decade and has in fact improved revenues, tax collections. Do you think such a thing could fly in South Africa?
Yes.
And if so, what would be the appropriate flat tax level?
Sure. That's an excellent question. The appropriate number, I've done some numbers on that, and if I'm not mistaken, I've done it some years ago, it will probably be around about 22-23% flat tax. It was somewhere there. That is for personal income taxes, value-added taxes, and corporate taxes, and dividend taxes as well, and capital gains taxes as well. So roughly there. That's what, if I remember correctly. I can't remember exactly. So it's going to be higher for some, for example, indirect taxes like VAT and so on, but lower for others like personal income taxes and so on. Okay, but your comment that you made, will a flat tax work? My suspicion is part of the reason why it works very well in many other countries in the world is because of the simplicity of the system. And the moment the system is simple, it's much more difficult to evade taxes. So that's a very important reason why countries that implemented that, and there are many other countries like, for example, Georgia also got a flat tax system, and I was there, and I'm very impressed with what they're doing. So that's part of the reason. So the simplicity of the system making it difficult to evade that. But keep in mind, although it's called a flat tax, it's not really a flat tax. And let me give you an example, because quite often capital gains is also taxed at a flat tax, but an income is taxed at the same rate. And those are fundamentally two completely different things. You can't really compare that. But yes, it's called a flat tax. It's not really a flat tax, but I guess the simplicity makes it very, very attractive. That's certainly something that we can consider in South Africa. Yes, excellent question. Sorry, just at the back. Yes, sir.
You talked very interesting about AI, but the one thing you didn't touch on is the implication on employment, and then that goes back to the use of taxes.
Yes. Yeah, the question was employment or unemployment. And the starting point is that I really don't care about unemployment. Because, you know, what I care about is wealth creation. I don't give it them. If I was unemployed and I've got a lot of money, I will be happy. So it's not about employment. Nobody wants to be employed. You want to have choices, of course, and you want to be rich. So I'm interested in getting the country rich. Politicians, unfortunately, quite often confuse two things. They think if you keep people busy, then they are employed. Those are not necessarily the same thing. So I'm not in favor of, it's easy to create jobs. You get 1,000 people to dig 1,000 holes and another 1,000 to fill it up. So I'm not interested in job creation. But your point is still valid. Because probably what is going to happen is that artificial intelligence or the fourth industrial revolution and robots and so on is going to lead to a lot of people losing their current employment, their current source of revenue. It's nothing new. We've been there before. We've been there many, many times before. There are many so-called industrial revolutions before that. And the result of that was a lot of jobs were indeed so-called destroyed. But that's the nature of the beast. And we actually have to encourage that. Because that's the part, that's the important part, and that's the wonderful, the best thing about the free market system, it keeps on changing all the time. And that includes, it keeps on destroying businesses, and it keeps on destroying jobs, and it keeps on getting rid of old technology, but at the same time, it creates new kind of jobs, new kind of businesses, and new technologies. And that's the process of growing an economy and the process of creating more wealth, essentially. And yes, it's certainly going to be quite disruptive to the labor force in South Africa. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be more disruptive to South Africa than to many other countries in the world. And the reason for that is that our people are not properly schooled. We do not have proper skills development in South Africa. It is an inferior schooling system that we have in South Africa, mostly because of politics, not because of money. We spend a lot of money on education, and our people are simply not prepared for the changes that are already happening. And that will lead to unemployment, increase in unemployment, and it's probably going to lead to even, well, a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots. Not that I have necessarily a problem with inequality. I don't care about inequality as long as the poor are better off. But it's certainly going to lead probably to more tension, especially amongst the people that can participate and the people that cannot participate in this new thing called the fourth industrial revolution. Yes, sir.
So can I shoot you two quick questions?
Sure.
I saw on TV the other day you seem to be supporting Tito Mbowene's recovery plan. You gave it a thumbs up. I wanted to ask you, why is Ramaphosa not publicly strongly backing the plan?
Yeah.
And then the second one is around the universal basic income. With the rise in tech and all that, what are your thoughts on universal basic income?
Yeah. Okay, let me start with the second one, then to the political question. A basic universal basic income, I guess that's an ideological question. As a free marketeer, what I do know is that I know many business people, and I can tell you, all the business people, successful business people that I know, and the wealthier they are, and I don't know that many wealthy ones, but the wealthier they are, the more they get involved in some sort of good deed or some sort of charity somewhere. And there's in fact a lot of proof that before this huge increase in the size of states, of governments, basically the past 50 years or past 100 years or so, that the private sector was much more involved in charities than what the private sector is today. So my answer to a basic income grant is that, apart from my ideological opposition to that, I'm not so sure that is the way to really uplift people. That's not, and certainly we as a community and as a society, I don't want anybody to die of hunger. And I believe that none of us will allow anybody to die of hunger. It will happen. We will go, and in fact, people do that already. So I'm totally against the basic income grant provided by the state. The private sector will do it voluntarily because they do it already and have done it in the past. Your question about Cyril Ramaphosa, I think Cyril Ramaphosa is a weak president. He's a weak president on a number of levels. The first, he has been elected with a tiny majority, so he's politically weak simply in terms of the number of votes he received. But not only that, his personality seems to be a personality of somebody that doesn't want to take a decision. He keeps on waiting for somebody else to tell him what to do. And a very good example is this 18 economists or 17 economists, 18 economists that he's just appointed. Now, I cannot tell you, I don't even agree with myself. They put 18 economists together in one room, you're going to get a complete demarcaspel in that bunch of economists. And that's an example. And that is exactly what is happening with Tito's plan as well. The president, he wants to sort of please everybody. He's a pleaser very much. He's playing the so-called long game, and he doesn't want to take the lead, unlike Tito Mboweni. Tito Mboweni says, I am the Minister of Finance, here's my plan, it's going to work, we're in trouble, follow me, I'm prepared to lead, and I'm prepared to lead you through very difficult times. I haven't heard the president saying that. And I want the president to say that. It's going to be tough, we have to take very difficult decisions. I am your man, I'm going to lead you, follow me. And he's not saying that. He asks everybody else, so what should we do? He's a consensus man. And I'm afraid we're at that stage of the economic collapse in South Africa, we simply cannot afford a consensus president. We need a ruthless president, and he's not there. Yes, sir.
You showed the exchange rate, 14.5, going down as low as 14, up to 2021. Is there an argument for actually bringing funds into South Africa and investing here in money market at 7%? And how long would that last?
Depending on who you are. The question is, can we bring money back? The answer to that is, unless you are a forex trader, unless that's your business to trade forex, don't try to time the market, especially the forex market. You're going to get it wrong. I promise you, I've been trying to do this for a long time. It doesn't work. So your decision as an individual is, I've identified certain risks. I'm going to mitigate this risk by doing A, B, and C, and that will include taking some of my portfolio and invest it abroad. And then you do it. And that's what you do. And until you change your mind for whatever reason, then you change your portfolio. But do not change your portfolio because of your expectations on the currency. That is wrong. If you are somebody else, if, for example, you're a trader, a capital market trader, a young guy that's 22 years, he's scared of nothing, and I was there as well, I can remember those years, and you know everything, then that's a completely different story. Then you're going to try to play the currency, and at the same time, you're going to try to play the bond market, and you're going to take your chances and take the hits that go with that as well. So my answer is no. I don't know what's going to happen to the currency. I've got reasons why I've got those specific numbers. I've got a certain model that I follow, but I will not advise people to trade on that because I know it's going to be wrong. Yes.
Okay, I think we need to move towards releasing Dawie. Are there more comments? No?
I'll take my cards out if anybody wants to. I'll just put it there. Somebody wants to.
Okay,
Thanks.
Donkey.
Okay,
Give him the suitable. Just a little technical issue while he was. I happen to know people who are putting together two companies, to buy decommissioned coal-fired power stations and refurbish them. And while we were sitting here, I just texted them, and they said there was actually a meeting just today on that. There's a foreign company and a local company who are bidding for the decommissioned power stations, and they can refurbish them and run them profitably as private business ventures. And that, according to them, will be what happens. Just an interesting point that, and then you might have seen the latest integrated resource plan. They plan to extend the life of Kuiberg by recommissioning it. So this can be done. If it can be done profitably is a big question. Completely agree with you on Medupi and Kusile, as in fact Eskom's former chief engineer Doug Cooney says the best thing to do with them is mothball them. He thinks there's no way they will ever actually produce power. Dawie, thank you very much. You are always entertaining and informative and challenging, and I have the great good fortune of now going to take Dawie to dinner, so I can get a free dinner Dawie. Not a free dinner, but a free dinner Dawie. And thank you for your attendance, questions and comments. Dawie is always worth engaging and listening to. He's terribly intimidating if he's sitting in an audience where I speak or he has me on his program. He's more intimidating than all the viewers out there. Thank you so much. Another round of applause for Dawie. And then more socializing and drinks and snacks. And Dawie's cards over here, I strongly advise you to go to him for business advice.